machine than everyone else.
All right. So without further ado, I would like to welcome, I suppose, our final keynote speaker, I think, right? Final plenary speaker, is that correct, Chris? To the stage. Last but certainly not least, please give a warm round of applause to Mandi, everybody. Mandi.
All right. Thanks for sticking around. I'm so glad I'm following Eco because I've got stuff that's going to borrow off of what he was talking about, in addition to all the things that I've been talking about for a million years. So I am Mandi Walls. I am legitimately, my title is DevOps Advocate at PagerDuty, because a lot of what we end up doing when we're talking to our customers is persuading them, hey man, yeah, you really want to do some of this DevOps-y kind of stuff versus this weird thing you're doing right now, right? So I'm not going to talk about PagerDuty. If you want to talk about incident response or postmortems or any of that stuff in the open spaces, I'm happy to do that. If you want to get in touch with me, I'm mwalls@pagerduty.com. I'm LNXCHK on all the socials, and you can find me on LinkedIn. So what is culture? Culture is everywhere. It's all the stuff that helps us relate to other human beings. The hard part, though, about culture is it starts forming for you as a human when you are a child, right? It's part of how you grow up. It's part of where you grew up, maybe the schools that you went to. It's part of your faith community. It's all of these things, all of these connections that you have to other people, how you relate to other people, and the assumptions that that enables you to make as you're facing new experiences. And as we are looking to generate new experiences in our organizations, we may find ourselves fighting against some of those cultural concepts that folks have always had. You might ask your friend, hey, you work at big company X, what's it like over there? What's the culture like? And the answer that you get back reflects that person's cultural values, as well as the values of the organization. Oh, we've got great PTO. Oh, we have great, learning opportunities. The managers are really good. Or you might get the dreaded, oh, it depends on the team, right? Because the organizational culture is super weak at the center, and it doesn't permeate down to all of the leaves in the organizational branches, right? So the joke is, we don't even notice it, right? So the fishbowl, for those in the back who can't read it, an old fish swims by two young fish, and he says, morning, boys, how's the water? And the young fish are like, what the hell's water, right? You don't even notice it. You don't even notice the culture when you're soaking in it. So let's go back. I'm not going back 15 years. I'm going back to the 14th century, to the Battle of Crécy, which happened not far from here. The English and the French were battling over control of France. I'm from the US. We didn't study this in high school because we just don't study European history most of the time. So I learned about this on Midsummer Murders. Anybody? British TV. Okay. So the Battle of Crécy, the English and the French are battling it out. And this is part of the 100 Years' War, which was actually 115 years or something like that, but we round. And so they find this nice place to do a battle. It's like a hill, it's a defensive position, and it's great. The English have come over the channel. They already decimated what passed for the French Navy, and they're basically wreaking havoc. So they settle in. It's like lunchtime. They're like, yeah, we're going to dig some pits. We're going to do our defensive positions, and then we're going to relax. Because you don't start a battle in the afternoon. You don't want to fight overnight. There's no lights, right? So they get their stuff all set up. And the French aren't that far away, and their riders are like, hey, the English are right up the road here. Let's go for it. And so the French come onto the field of battle, and they assume that the battle is going to happen the way battles have always happened up until this point. This is 1346, okay? So there's no, cannons or any of that stuff. This is pre-gunpowder. And so what they're expecting is the French have cavalry, they have knights, they have foot soldiers, and they have some crossbowmen, right? Like the little things that are, they're very, not super reliable, and it's very close combat. So that's what they're expecting. But the English have brought the Welsh with them. And with the Welsh comes the Welsh longbow. This is a 2-meter bow, absolutely humongous. It takes somewhere between 85 and 150 foot-pounds of torque to pull it. It's an amazing weapon, and the Welshmen can pull up to 12 arrows a minute. This is a barrage against the French. They're coming into the plain of battle, expecting the battle to become the same as it has been against the English for hundreds of years. And the English are like, we are changing this up. We are doing this different this time because we brought the Welsh with us. They didn't want to come, but we brought them anyway. So what happens is the French are basically wiped out. They have no concept of what is happening to them, no ability to regroup and refresh and sort of recreate what might be happening and reconsider their options. No concept of that at all. They're coming into this the way they have always done it, and they get absolutely blown off the field by a much smaller force that is much more powerful based on just having this one particular weapon. Now, that means then, after this, the Welsh longbow is the primary offensive weapon in Europe until the introduction of gunpowder. That's like 100 years later, right? So it was a very pinnacle sort of thing. And there's a link at the end for a long podcast on this, which is super interesting, that you can listen to later. So why is this so hard, right? Hundreds and hundreds of years of history teach us that culture is so ingrained. It's so hard to change. Ikuo just told us, like, their DevX was suffering because the major culture of the organization was completely different from what they wanted, right? We see that all the time. And McKinsey, regardless of how you feel about them and their opinions on software development, they've been all up in everybody's business legitimately for 100 years. So they've seen some stuff, right? Number 3 here I'm going to just call out. Healthy culture facilitates adaptability. 70% of change initiatives fail. We talked about this yesterday in the open spaces. And you're not alone, right? 70% of change initiatives fail. 70% of those are for cultural reasons. You can do the math. 70% of 70% is half. You are 1 in 2 probably going to fail for your change initiatives because of your culture, right? So super important. Unhealthy cultures lead to underperformance and potentially failure. That doesn't mean that the pundits aren't going to tell you how to do it better or try to, right? This is just a selection of headlines from the Harvard Business Review. It was actually one of the cover stories for the July-August 2024 edition. It's super important. People want to persuade you on how to build more curiosity into your culture, build more hardiness, supports mental health, all these great things that we want to be part of our organizational cultures. But it's super hard, right? There's lots of different models about culture. Nathan talked about the Western model yesterday. That's a good one to look at because it's nice and simple. The paper that it originates from is also very short, and you should read it. He was working with the medical field, doctors and nurses and specialists in healthcare. Another culture researcher, Edgar Schein, he was a psychologist and a professor. He started doing some of the foundational research in what we call organizational behavior in like the 1980s, right? All of this stuff has sort of arisen after World War II when we see the rise of large organizations that aren't military and aren't religious, right? Prior to, say, World War I, you had so many fewer large organizations. People didn't really join up into a company so much as they do now. There was obviously the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company were some of the largest organizations of their time, but sort of organized a little bit differently than what we see today. So Edgar put out his components of culture, and he broke it down into 3 components. The basic assumptions at the bottom, sort of your foundational assumptions about the culture. These are often set by the founders. So they stay persistent through the lifetime of the organization. They're very hard to change. They're things that people don't even notice, they just kind of take for granted. They don't often notice them until like somebody comes in from outside and points them out. So I work at PagerDuty. Before I joined PagerDuty, I worked at Chef. And Chef, thanks to Nathan and a few others, was a very sweary company, right? Fuck yeah, right? Fuck yeah. So you get up and give a talk about Chef, and it's full of F-bombs. And I joined PagerDuty, and it was like weeks, months before I heard anybody even say the S word. And I'm like, they don't swear. What's going on? And like I talked to my boss, I'm like, am I allowed to use bad words when I'm talking to PagerDuty? And they're like, well, we kind of don't. Like, PagerDuty's super Canadian, right? Like, it's a different culture. They're very nice, and it's not super sweary. Like, occasionally, the CEO will get a little excited, and she'll swear at us a little bit, but, like, most of the time, it's pretty chill. And I'm like, this is really different. We didn't even notice. I'm like, okay, I did. Because now I have to, like, redo my vocabulary, and I don't know what's going on. So it just kind of permeates, right? And then based on that, you've got your values. They have the things that you say are important. EcoO showed us some great values, right? Things that are important to their organization. Things about how you learn, your mission statements, and all those rah-rah things that you put out there that people grab onto. They're super important for aligning people together. They might be aspirational. You might not actually be reaching them all the time, but they're there as our goals, as our things that we want for the organization. And then finally, you get the whole big swath of artifacts, and this is all kinds of stuff, right? This can be your advertising. It could be any of the white papers and things that you publish. It could be, so in the US for a while, there's like some weird organizational cultures, like IBM had like a cheer or a song or something like that. Walmart had like a song when you started your shift. Like those things kind of permeate and become part of the artifacts of the organization. So they become super important for things to glom onto. They help people sort of align their decision making to say, oh, our value is adaptability, our value is innovation, our value is experimentation, versus our value is don't touch that, right? So keeping things aligned to the values that you state and put together. And like I said, there's lots of different models, so this is just one as an example. There's a couple of others that start at the bottom with experiences, and those are super great too, for thinking about, the people that you've brought in, what their experiences are in life, and are they different? Are they the same? Have you hired everyone who looks like a clone of everyone else? So your experience pool is very shallow, and so you don't necessarily relate to everyone that you want to in your customer base. So there's lots of very interesting models there. One of the things, though, that Shine gets into is occupational versus organizational culture. And I find the occupational culture stuff super interesting because I think it's where DevOps is kind of hitting a wall. So occupational culture is how certain occupations and professions have more in common individuals to each other than they do the other divisions of their organization. So his example is chemists. So if you're doing sort of wet bench chemistry, right, you've got your white powders and your clear liquids and you're titrating and you've got your pipettes and whatever else is going on to like 6 degrees of the decimal point for all of your calculations. Chemists at Eli Lilly, Novartis, Merck, whatever, their work culture is more similar to each other than it is to the other folks that work at those companies, right? They have a professional occupational culture that sort of defines how you do work, how you publish that work, how you discover new things. And so they relate more as a group occupationally than they do to, say, the other folks that they work with day to day in the same building. We face that as well, right? We're here, DevOps days, talking DevOps. We relate to each other a lot more, maybe, than we relate to the other folks in our organizations. We're able to talk the same language. We have the same jokes. The video that was running this morning was very funny, but like, not sure my product manager would totally understand all of that stuff, right? So we have this relationship to each other. In the picture, the guy on the right is doing some kind of code, right? He's in an IDE, I can tell on his right side monitor. I don't know what he's necessarily working on, but I can start to make assumptions about what his workflow might look like because I have a picture of software engineering, people use IDEs, and things that they do. So what we can use there, right, we make some assumptions, we can start to build some camaraderie, and we build up a shared culture with those kinds of folks. And where that sort of then falls apart is when we want to start to change that. I don't want my developers to be the stereotypical solo developer in the basement or in a closet or sitting in the dark working on code by themselves. Agile tried to put this together, right? The Agile Manifesto is very much about working collaboratively and bringing things together and breaking down that original set of stereotypes and even breaking down the original developer silo, right? And then we're now DevOps, and we want to break down in between all of those other silos. So some super interesting things there. And when, is John still in the room? So he probably cringes when I do this, but like when I talk to some of our customers, some of them I have to go back to first principles, back to why you actually want to do this and how you can actually start to put it together. So has anybody read John's, this is from 2011, it's What DevOps Means to Me, right? It's super early. Progress, thankfully, has left it up on the Chef blog as if they've taken over. But he broke it down into 4 basic components: culture, automation, metrics, and sharing. And why I pull this up for people is that when you're talking about being a team within a larger organizational culture, there are only so many things you can influence for your day-to-day. Culture is super hard to do that with, right? So people tend to glom onto the other 3 things because they're very easy to change as a development organization, as the operations team, as some kind of tech team, right? We can automate whatever we want to. We've got some bash scripts. Maybe you're using Rundeck, and if you are, I want to talk to you. There's lots of things that allow you to do that. But those are things that we make decisions about. We purchase with our budget, and they don't necessarily get out into the rest of the organization. Metrics the same way, right? We can buy whatever or load up some open source metrics solutions, and that's great. But it can stay contained into our own team if we don't do the sharing part. And we can share our own stuff as well. And you can do that without the blessing of management. You can basically say, here's our Slack channel about things we've learned about Kafka. And you'll be like, yeah, man, I want to learn about that. You need 2 teams away. Like, that's great. Or we can do a lunch and learn on what we learned about CI/CD pipelines this month. Great. You don't need executive buy-in for that. What you do then, however, need executive buy-in for is manipulating that culture. Because you're manipulating the things the organization values, the things it rewards, the things that it finds the most benefit out of, and trying to do that from the bottom up is very hard. So unfortunately, I have to tell people, no, DevOps transformation is really difficult to do from the bottom up, so let's find an executive to help you with your buy-in. There's also some interesting stuff that sort of relates to this called research into microcultures. So microcultures are related to occupational cultures in that they're very small and contained. They're also very opt-in, right? So until we got to the point where there was a lot of folks with access to the internet, the idea of an optional culture was pretty new, because a lot of your culture was based on where you lived, where you went to school, what job you did. But when we've got folks that now have like an online life, they can join a website somewhere and participate in a microculture. Now, the irony is, and what made me laugh when I first read this, was that the early community they were doing the research in was Slashdot. And I was like, yeah, Cowboy Neil, let's do it. So very, very specific. A lot of folks that shared a lot of knowledge, shared a lot of slang, a lot of lingo, a lot of values about open source software and those kinds of things, but it was all opt-in, super interesting. And we find that as we're trying to sort of spread the good word about DevOps in our larger organizational cultures. Like, get a bit of opt-in. That's what we start here and get some success, and people will want to join in, right? They want to join, they want to opt in to your microculture as you expand your DevOps practice. So lots of interesting stuff across the field in organizational behavior these days, which is great. So, in summary, culture exists as your human connections. All the people that you bump into, that you talk to, that you share with, that make you think about things are all part of influencing your culture. It helps you build all your assumptions, it brings in all your values, encompasses all the artifacts that your organization produces. We hope that it can be improved. We try to improve it for ourselves as much as possible. Your manager hopefully can work with you and say, what would make things better for you? What can we do to improve things for you? But it's hard to do across the entire organization, especially for very large ones. And for a funny thing, the screen capture on the right is like this dude posts that he's leaving for the weekend as if he's leaving the organization in the local chat. And like the team goes bananas and posts like 1 million different emojis as reaction to this. And the top level is, you can gauge a company's culture by how robust and unhinged the Slack emoji repertoire is. I'm like, yeah, you probably can, right? There's a lot of stuff in there that's pretty funny and makes no sense to anyone else and is, related to where these folks are coming from. So a lot of very funny and interesting things there. So a bunch of resources for you. And I will post this probably on LinkedIn next week for folks who follow me there. The first one's the interesting one. This is Cautionary Tales. Does anybody know Cautionary Tales podcast? Tim Harford is an economist based in the UK, and this is one of his shows. And the episode is called The French Knight's Guide to Corporate Culture. So it's very informative and really relates to how humans naturally gravitate to these kinds of corporate cultures. And there's a couple of other things up there. But the last one, too, you want to read Westrom's original paper. You can find that. It was published in 2004. But it's super interesting. So that's my time. Thank you so much for having me.